Hi, everyone. I threw a lot of vocabulary at you this week, and I wanted to take a moment to just review everything to make sure that you were totally clear on what we've done so far so that we can get ready to really start applying what we've learned in the quiz that you're going to complete when you are done with this video. So, a closer look at the study of genetics. Really specifically, what we're going to be doing today is examine some of the work that Gregor Mendel did. As you learned in your readings, he was a monk and he did a lot of work with pea plants. As a matter of fact, that is what he is most famous for his work for. And in fact, when it came to pea plants, he studied several different attributes or traits of pea plants, everything from the seed shape and color to flower color to pod shape and color, where the flowers are positioned on the plant, and how long or how tall the flowers were. From his data, we were able to, we being Mendel, was able to come up with some really big ideas. He was able to come up with the idea that individual factors control the inheritance of the traits in the peas. And the factor that controls each trait exists in pairs. The female parent will contribute one factor, while the male parent contributes the other factor. And the third thing that he came up with was the idea that one factor can hide or mask the other factor. Now, we know today that those factors that Mendel kept referring to are known as alleles. And an organism's traits are controlled by the alleles that it inherits from its parents. So this key point being that they get one allele from each parent. Some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. So even though they get one allele from each parent, you have a dominant form of a trait and a recessive form of the trait. And the dominant trait is the one that always shows up in the organism when the allele is present, whereas the recessive allele remains hidden whenever the dominant allele is present. So in order to see the recessive trait, you need to have two of the recessive alleles. Now, the big question that Mendel was able to answer was this idea of how we were able to track alleles. And scientists in general use symbols to represent each of the alleles. So first of all, what you need to understand is they have a letter that represents the trait. And the dominant allele is represented by a capital letter, and the recessive allele is represented by a lowercase letter. So what does that look like? Let's take a look at the trait of plant height. So we are going to assign a letter, and I could choose any letter that I want in the alphabet. For the purposes of what we're doing today, I'm just going to use the letter T. So tall stems, because that's one form of what the trait can look like, will be represented by a capital T. Short stems are represented by a lowercase t. And again, remembering that the uppercase is dominant, lowercase is recessive. What we're going to do is remembering that we get one allele from each parent, meaning that every one of these offsprings is going to have two alleles. There are two possible combinations they can get. They can get something that is known as homozygous, and that's an organism which has two of the same alleles for a given trait. So that might be represented as a capital H, or lowercase h, lowercase h. The other form that they could have is heterozygous, and this is an organism that has different alleles for a given trait. And in this example, there's only one that they can have, and it is a capital H, lowercase h. Now, I find that saying capital and lowercase can be kind of annoying, so I always refer to it as big H, little h, knowing that the capital or the big H would represent the dominant and the lowercase or little h would represent the recessive. So the next question that you have to ask yourself is, what will each of these plants look like when you have the various combinations? So remember from your reading and from the videos that you saw previously, the allele combinations are known as the genotype. And what it looks like on the outside is the phenotype. So here's the example that we had of plant height. So big T, or big T, little t, you'll notice that they both have the big T or the capital T. So it is going to show up as the dominant form, which is tall. The other example is little t, and little t. These are both lowercase, which means that you have both of the recessive, so the plant is going to be short. So this is what it looks like on the outside. So genotype are the genes, phenotype is the appearance.
What we're going to do now is a little bit of practice as it relates to genotype and phenotype. Key thing you need to remember is that genotype relates to the letters, phenotype relates to what the offspring is going to look like. In this example that we have here, we have these two imaginary animals, and there are two forms of fur color. There's black and there's white. Black is dominant, white is recessive. What we need to do is choose what letter first we want to represent the trait with. In this example of fur color, I'm going to use the letter F to represent the trait. The dominant is going to be written with an uppercase F. The recessive form is going to be written with a lowercase f. So when I go down and I look at my possible genotypes, I'm going to go through all the genotypes first. Homozygous means the same. Dominant is going to be capital. So I'm going to end up having two capital F's there, two uppercase F's. Homozygous recessive is going to be two lowercase f's because, again, homozygous means the same. In my next example, heterozygous, what I'm going to have is a capital F and a lowercase f because hetero means different. Once we have all of the genotypes figured out, we can go through and figure out what the associated phenotype is. So when we have capital letters, it's going to be dominant. So this animal will have black fur. The next example, homozygous recessive, lowercase f's. Because there is no uppercase, we're going to see the recessive trait, which is white fur. And finally, in heterozygous, where you have both a big F and a little f, what we need to do is remember that the big F, the dominant, is always going to mask the recessive. So in this case, the animal will have black fur. Let's look at another example. In this example, we have monkeys, and the trait that we're going to be looking at is tail length. So I've decided that I'm going to use the letter T to represent the trait of tail length. The dominant form is going to be short tails, which is represented with a capital T, and the recessive form is a long tail, which is represented with a lowercase t. So just like I did before, I'm going to go through and do my genotypes first. Homozygous, meaning the same. Dominant is going to be the uppercase. So I'm going to have two uppercase T's for the homozygous dominant. For homozygous recessive, this is going to be homozygous, meaning the same. Recessive is our lowercase ones. I have two lowercase T's. And then finally for heterozygous. Hetero means different. So I will have big T, little t. Now that I've gone through and I've identified all of the genotype or the letter combinations that I can have, I need to go back and do the associated phenotype. If you recall, in this example, the capital T represents the dominant form, which is a short tail. Lowercase t's represent the recessive trait, which is a long tail. And then whenever I have a heterozygous combination, the recessive trait is going to be masked by the dominant trait. So this monkey will have a short tail. If you can keep track of what the vocabulary means, genotypes are the letters, phenotype is what it looks like, that's the first step that you can do. Remember that for your dominant and your recessive trait, we always have the same letter. It's just one is uppercase, one is lowercase. You can choose whatever letter that you want to represent the trait, in this case tail length. However, you want to make sure that you choose letters that are easy to distinguish from each other, uppercase and lowercase. So for example, if I decided I wanted to use the letter S, that might be a problem because a capital S and a lowercase s look an awful lot alike. So there's what you have for genotypes and phenotypes, and this is what your practice quiz is going to be on.